Welcome back to the History Fix. We're trying to get a handle on the way in which geography shapes modern history, the way in which Europe's distinctive geography sets it apart and enables it to pioneer the development of world capitalism, the way in which Africa's distinctive geography held it back. We talked about that last time, about the way in which Africa, relatively speaking, was a prisoner of its own geography, its ability to develop more constrained than other parts of the world. What I want to do this time is to talk a little bit about Asia. I'm going to focus mainly on China, but I'm going to say a few things about India as well, and I'm going to, I hope, use those as examples which give us some generalizations which we can apply to the civilizations of Asia as a whole. Because the story is certainly different from the story in Africa, especially if we look at China and India, which are vast areas, both of which have had and still have enormous populations and extremely rich agriculture. And the way in which this played out was very different from Africa, because it did mean that in the case of both China and India, as we look through ancient history and medieval history, bringing us up to the beginning of the modern era, what we see are a series of very, very large civilizations indeed, with very powerful centralized states. And that already is a clue to the problem. But let's just get our heads around the scale of it, first of all. Chinese civilization, if you look at it in the medieval period, dwarfs anything that was going on in Europe at that time. The Chinese there were hundreds of millions of Chinese, of course. The agriculture was very, very rich. It was possible to create an extraordinarily wealthy culture on this basis. There were many cities of 1 million or more people in China, when the biggest European cities, places like London and Paris, for example, were only 1/10 of the size. The Chinese were in the forefront of technological innovation, all kinds of things like long distance, overseas shipping, the development of gunpowder, massive irrigation works and the building of canals, the invention of gunpowder, paper, porcelain, a whole series of things like these which show that Chinese civilization is way ahead of what was happening in Europe at the same time. And yet, this civilization doesn't achieve that takeoff to capitalism, that takeoff to a dynamic commercial economy that eventually gives rise to an industrial revolution. There's technological innovation, but there isn't an economic takeoff. And that, of course, begs the question, why not? Well, lots of surplus is being generated, much more surplus wealth in China than in Europe at the time, certainly much more surplus wealth that is in the control of one unified, centralized state than anything in Europe, which, remember, is divided into lots of relatively small states by comparison. But that siphoning of wealth to the top, that concentration of surplus wealth at the top of Chinese society, was itself a major problem. It meant the empowerment of an imperial bureaucracy. It meant that the focus of society's attention was on the emperor and the court and the class of mandarins who formed the state bureaucracy. that state bureaucracy committed to that process of siphoning wealth to the top, to empower the state and to enrich the class of mandarins who dominated it, who formed the ruling class. And at a more local level, the local landowners and the merchants in the different regions and local cities of China, because the state was so powerful, because the bureaucracy was so dominant, they saw their own economic and social and political advancement primarily in terms of state service. There was a kind of career ladder, a bureaucratic career ladder that everybody who was on the make was seeking to climb. So you've got a siphoning of wealth to the top and a relative underdevelopment of those middle layers of society which are so important in the history of Europe. A very top-heavy state bureaucracy resting on a base of peasant labour. The vast majority of Chinese, of course, were peasants toiling in the fields, toiling to enrich the landlords and the merchants and the bureaucrats, the mandarins, really toiling in the interests of an essentially parasitic ruling class that was not seeking to invest resources in the development of estates, the development of the economy, but was investing resources in the development of centralized state power and the bureaucratic career system. So you get through Chinese history a series of tremendous revolts by the Chinese peasantry. Periodically, every few hundred years, there's a tremendous revolt from below of the Chinese peasantry against their exploitation, but without a clear vision of a different way of organizing the world, without a leadership which has the sense that the whole of China might be reconstructed, rebuilt on a different basis. What happens each time there is one of those great revolts from below is that the emperor who is considered to be a bad emperor is replaced by a new emperor, probably a dynasty emerging from within the peasant movement itself, but this new emperor simply creates a new dynasty, a new version of essentially the same system, and the system reverts to type. This is really Chinese history's revolving door, a succession of different dynasties, each one created by revolt from below, but each dynasty in practice essentially the same as its predecessor, with the result that the basic fabric of Chinese society remains the same. I think a significant factor in Chinese history too is this: it's so big, the amount of wealth that's being concentrated by the state is so huge that China is very secure, relatively little investment in the military, relatively little need to innovate in response to outside threats, and that sheer size of China, the sheer security of the Chinese state, makes it particularly conservative. Slightly different pattern in India, and I'm going to conclude by just saying a word or two about India, because again we have a succession of dynasties, based upon agricultural labour, based upon the peasantry, based upon the creaming off of agricultural surpluses and the use of those surpluses to sustain the elite at the top of Indian society, but Indian society more open to invasion, in particular from Central Asia. Generally speaking, new Indian dynasties like the Mughals, for example, they are invaders from the north, and India tends to be less united, more fractured, more divided into separate polities through its long history in ancient and medieval times, and that means that a much larger chunk of the available surplus than is the case in China gets invested in armies, in soldiers, in fortifications, because warfare, internal warfare, is a much bigger feature of Indian history. but the effect is the same. You may be siphoning off your wealth to sustain a vast state bureaucracy, or you may be siphoning off your wealth to sustain the armed forces you need to defend any particular dynasty. That's the Chinese pattern and the Indian pattern. But the consequences in terms of economic and social and cultural development are the same. There's a draining away of resources from the development of, let's reduce it to its basics, the development of the productivity of labour. And what is crucial about what is happening in Europe is that there are forces in the middle sectors of society, relatively wealthy, relatively powerful, who are finding the space to begin the process of capital investment, capital accumulation, the ploughing of resources, not into the aggrandizement of the state and the elite, not into the building of armies and the fighting of wars, but increasingly resources being put into the development of the economy, the development of industry, the development of trade lines and colonies, and the accumulation of capital. That's an absolutely critical difference between Europe and Asia, and it becomes decisive as we move into the beginning of the modern period, into the 16th and the 17th century. And very soon, and we'll be talking about this next time on the History Fix, we will see that more advanced European capitalist colonial power beginning to impact decisively on what is happening in other parts of the world that are less developed. On the History Fix next time. We are facing the greatest crisis in the history of humanity. Capitalism is driving us towards climate catastrophe. To understand how we got here and how we get out of it, we really need to understand human history. What we're trying to do here at the History Fix is to give us the understanding of the past that we need to equip us to fight for a better future. If you like what we're doing, please share and subscribe, and also contribute to our Patreon page. Thanks very much.